Dr. Rachel Teubner, our third speaker, is the author of Dante and the Practice of Humility, a theological commentary on the Divine Comedy. When we think of all the forms of pilgrimage for the Christian, what could be the highest and most precious pilgrimage than that of the soul? That pilgrimage is set out for us in Dante's poem as we set out through hell, purgatory, and heaven. We are privileged to have Dr. Teubner here, who is clearly a friend of Dante, to help us along that same pilgrimage. Currently, she is a visiting scholar in medieval studies at Harvard University. It's across the river. And the director of Christian education at the Parish of the Good Shepherd in Waban, Massachusetts. We know her and her beautiful family as former parishioners here at the Advent. We're delighted to have her back here now for the third week in a row, because Rachel has been teaching in our adult education program called On Track the past 2 Sundays. We will attempt to lure her back to On Track, but now we have her here, and I give you Dr. Teubner.
Good morning. Is it still morning? Good afternoon. I'm really honored and delighted to be reflecting and learning with you about pilgrimage today. My subject is Dante's Divine Comedy. I haven't walked the Camino, but I have been walking with this poem, dare I say, journeying with this poem for about 15 years. And I want to talk to you about what we might learn from this poem about pilgrimage. I'll start with a few basic points. First slide, please. I'm a scholar of literature, not a historian, but I want to start with a little bit of history, because the circumstances of Dante's composition of this poem may be interesting to us as we think about a theology and a spirituality of pilgrimage. So a little bit about Dante himself. He was born Dante Alighieri in 1265 in Florence and was baptized there. This is the Florence Baptistery on the right. He was a family man and a poet. He was the author of some minor unfinished treatises on rhetoric and politics, and he was a statesman in Florence, which in his lifetime was continually seized by rival political factions which disagreed on the sovereignty or relative sovereignty of the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. At the age of 37, Dante was exiled from Florence. That was in 1302. And I will give you the brief history of why that occurred. Dante became a prior, the equivalent of a city councillor, when his political party, the White Guelphs, took control of Florence in 1302. Only 2 months later, while Dante was at Rome, the Black Guelphs gained power. Dante was accused of financial wrongdoing and was barred from returning to Florence, possibly as retribution for having exiled some of his rivals during his brief time in office. After Dante's exile in 1302, he never returned to Florence. He remained in exile, away from Florence, away from his family, away from this baptistery, for the rest of his days. He was what we call a wanderer, a perennial house guest, always able to find someone to stay with, mostly in Tuscany, we think, while working in the homes of his hosts and drawing on either their libraries or texts that he knew by heart in order to write his comedy. He drew on the Bible, the liturgy, classical literature and philosophy, and even the work of contemporary poets whom he had known in Florence. So it was in these years and under these conditions of exile that Dante wrote the comedy. He was exiled in 1302. He began to write the comedy, we think, around 1304, 1306, likely while staying somewhere in Tuscany. Eventually, he found a patron in Can Grande della Scala, Lord of Verona, who hosted him for many years in Verona, and later he found a second patron who hosted him in Ravenna, where he died. Dante did not choose a life of exile. It happened to him, and life for Dante suddenly became a journey, a wandering existence, apparently always driven by the longing to return home to Florence. Dante was, in this sense, an inadvertent pilgrim. We know something of Dante's intentions for the comedy because of a letter to Can Grande della Scala, the same Can Grande who hosted him in Verona during the final decades of his life. Next slide, please. This is what the letter says about the purposes of the poem: to remove those living from a state of misery and to bring them to a state of happiness. It is a poem that presents itself as being on a mission, not only to transform Dante, the poet and character who is its protagonist, but actually to transform those who read it. And let me add transparently that I approach Dante's poem as working within a complex religious tradition and also as doing work that is boldly theological and spiritual. It seeks to bring good news, the good news, to its readers. It works to transform the reader and to initiate us, even convert us, in the most dynamic sense of that word, into an ever deeper knowledge and love of God. In that sense, Dante's comedy is not only a story about a pilgrimage or a journey, it is an invitation to participate in a journey, not only with our feet, but also as readers with heart and soul and mind. Dante's poem is, in fact, extraordinarily physical and graphic in its sense of the body's role in pilgrimage. Next slide, please. We can see this in part in the ways that Dante's comedy reflects an interest in actual pilgrimage as it was understood and practiced in his lifetime. It is no coincidence that Dante sets his poem during Holy Week in the year 1300, which was declared a Jubilee year by Pope Boniface VIII. During that year, Pope Boniface offered Christians the option of a pilgrimage to Rome with the same spiritual rewards ordinarily reserved for pilgrimages to Jerusalem: the complete remission of all their sins. It is not unlikely that Dante himself took advantage of this opportunity. It was enormously popular. The French historian Henri Ropes estimated about 2 million turn-of-the-century Christians made pilgrimages to Rome in this Jubilee year. We also find the suggestion of eyewitness, of personal experience in Inferno 18, when Dante looks down into a ditch crowded with panders and seducers, moving in opposite directions according to their sins, and compares them to the Romans' organization of pilgrim traffic in 1300. And I'm just going to read all the text in English for the sake of time. Thus the Romans have taken measures in the year of the Jubilee that over the bridge the people must pass carefully, so that on one side they have their faces toward the castle and go on to St. Peter's, and on the other side they go on toward the mount. Well, if you think it's crowded in here, next slide, please. At the very end of the poem, in Paradiso 31, Dante draws on what we might today call a peak experience of pilgrimage to Rome in particular. The practice of visiting the image of Christ, miraculously given to Saint Veronica when she offered the exhausted, bleeding Christ her veil to wipe his face. The Veronica veil was kept at St. Peter's Basilica, and Dante draws on this image to describe the way that Dante responds to seeing Saint Bernard in the Empyrean, the highest sphere of heaven. The sight of Bernard increases Dante's longing to see the true image of Christ, as one who, perhaps from Croatia, comes to see our Veronica, who, because of his ancient hunger, is not sated, but says in his thought, as long as it is shown, my Lord Jesus Christ, true God, was your semblance indeed made like that? So was I, gazing at the lively charity of he who in this world contemplating, tasted that peace. So the physical realities of pilgrimage in the Jubilee year, the realities of thronging crowds and of the exhilarating effects of beholding a miraculous image of Christ, are a poetic resource for Dante. He draws on them to describe what he saw in hell and in heaven. These examples give Dante's journey some historical ground as connected with the practices of the day. But what does Dante's poem have to do with pilgrimage today? Here is an answer in one word: purgatory. Next slide, please. So here is a chart of all of Dante's afterlife with its 3 realms: hell on the bottom, purgatory in the middle, paradise on top. And it's helpful, I think, to look at them all as part of one world. Inferno is that upside-down funnel shape at the bottom. Purgatory is the mountain in the middle. And then paradise above and beyond everything else. But of Dante's 3 realms, the middle realm, Dante's purgatory, is the one that stages for us a process of profound moral and spiritual transformation. Let me try to explain how it does that. Dante begins with Inferno, and Inferno is the most commonly read, so let's start there. Next slide, please. Dante's hell is a cold, dark pit, shaped like a funnel with circles or ridges descending down and growing narrower, until at the very bottom of that funnel, that pit, Dante and his guide Virgil encounter Satan, whose body is encased in ice, and they discover that they need to climb down Satan's body in order to make their way out of hell. It is a strange and terrifying moment in the poem, not least because, in the middle of it, Dante and Virgil discover that they are upside down, or rather that hell is upside down, and that therefore in climbing Satan's body, Dante and Virgil are actually climbing up. The funnel, which they thought was like this, is actually like this. The moment dramatically exposes Satan's rebellion against God as a delusion. Satan was persuaded that he might rule over his own kingdom, and instead he becomes profoundly subject to God's kingdom. So for the last time we see Satan in Dante's hell, Satan is serving as an immobilized scala, a staircase or a ladder, an exit plank, inadvertently bearing Dante and Virgil out of hell with his own body. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Same slide. Thank you. As readers, we experience this spatial orientation along with the pilgrim and his guide. We share Dante's line of sight, looking one last time on Satan fixed in ice before seeing le cose belle, the beautiful things that heaven carries through a round opening. And then we came out to look again at the stars. That is the end of Inferno. So purgatory begins with a new sense of what's up and what's down. A night sky, an escape from hell's oppressive air. These are markers of the new world, of the upper realms. And they are also markers of what sets Dante's vision of purgatory apart from his contemporaries. For Dante, purgatory was distinctly unlike hell. It has to begin with a dramatic reorientation, a hard break, a separation from the old hellish ways. Next slide, please. For Dante's purgatory is distinctly unlike hell. Jacques Le Goff credited Dante with giving purgatory its noblest representation. Prior to Dante, the painters and writers of the Middle Ages typically imagined purgatory as a torture chamber, imposing hellish sufferings, but with the difference of temporality. Time was passing. It would come to an end. When the soul purged of its sin would advance to heaven. Dante retains this difference. Souls in Dante's purgatory are indeed passing time according to their earthly sins. But where Dante's contemporaries had represented purgatory as an upper chamber of hell, Dante imagined and rendered purgatory anew as the wide foyer of heaven. Next slide, please. The Dante scholar Peter Hawkins has said that for Dante, geography became the handmaiden to theology. He brought purgatory up from the horrors of the underworld, turned it into a 7-story mountain at the antipodes from Jerusalem, and placed it in the bright light of day. Dante showed the site of penance to border Eden rather than hell, thus suggesting that penitence properly culminates in the restoration of innocence and joy. What he portrayed offered a sense of health and excitement in the refining fire, of exhilaration over more discoveries awaiting the broken and contrite heart. We'll go back to the previous slide. So you can see at the top the earthly paradise. That is still part of Mount Purgatory, but it is a pleasant place that strongly resembles Eden. So when I say that Dante's purgatory borders Eden, that's what I mean. That's where you end. That's the earthly paradise, a preparation for the real one. Purgatory's proximity to Eden does not turn purgatory into paradise, for pain is essential to Dante's process of purgation. Yet pain itself is understood and represented differently here. Torment is no longer the right word. Here, pain is salutary for spiritual maturation. Souls do not so much endure punishment as engage in productive physical pain, through which the soul recovers its lost conformity to Christ, forging a newly Christic identity and anticipating the recovery of its own flesh at the general resurrection. The existence of souls in both hell and paradise, by contrast, is fixed. Existence is endured below and enjoyed above. There is no journey and no time for shades in hell and saints in paradise. Thus, while Dante remains a pilgrim throughout his journey to God, it is only in purgatory that the souls he meets are likewise on pilgrimage, purposefully taking the painful steps that will transform them and fit them for paradise. Among Dante's 3 realms, then, purgatory in particular is the theater that dramatizes the soul on pilgrimage and that most closely parallels our earthly existence. And these rich affinities are uniquely suggestive for our interest today in Christian pilgrimage and its moral and spiritual transformations and rewards. With the time that remains, I want to invite you to read with me passages from Purgatorio 10 and 11, where we find Dante on the terrace of pride in the fellowship of other pilgrims. Next slide. They are on the terrace of pride as souls beyond the grave, assigned to this region. But Dante has something in common with these souls. Dante has a special connection to the terrace of pride. He confesses in Purgatorio 13 that he anticipates spending some time here when he returns to this realm in earnest after his death. And in these passages, I think we see a record of the ongoing process of Dante's transformation. There are moments in the narration when we sense Dante's pride. There are moments when he writes pridefully. Or we might even say there are moments when the poem is prideful. And there are moments when Dante writes humbly. Or we might say there are moments when the poem is humble. This first terrace introduces Dante, the pilgrim, to the penitent practices of purgation. Every time I say P, the mic pops, and I am saying a lot of P's right now, so bear with me. For the penitent souls on the Terrace of Pride, purgation includes meditation on examples of humility. These examples appear as visibili parlare, visible speech, little scenes carved into the cliffs of the terrace, and so lifelike in their rendering that they seem to speak, so lifelike that we are asked to believe that they were divinely carved by God. Dante is drawing here on a medieval art historical trope of visibili parlare, visible speech, as divinely given art that provokes the viewer to moral conversion. These scenes are like little three-penny operas of humility in action. Mary at the Annunciation giving her reply to the angel Gabriel, David dancing before the ark with handmaids singing beside him. The penitent souls meditate on these examples as part of their spiritual reformation. In the last lines of Purgatorio 10, we see the penitent, prideful souls themselves. On every terrace, penitent souls engage in a bodily practice, a painful bodily practice, in order to train and habituate themselves to whatever virtue is the antidote to their besetting their besetting vice. So on the Terrace of Pride, souls undertake a physical practice of humility. They walk bent over to support the heavy stones on their backs. And you can see this in the image. We have here those huge round black things are massive stones on the backs of the prideful penitent. They don't look very much like bipeds right now, do they? It's interesting. The doubled over posture of the prideful is intended both to illustrate and to cure the problem of pride that burdens these souls. As they progress on the terrace, they will eventually be able to turn their heads to become eventually fully upright. There's a scholar named Heather Webb who teaches at Yale. She connects these postures of penitence in Dante's Purgatorio with the modus orandi, or 9 ways of prayer, of St. Dominic. In the 9 ways of St. Dominic, we are told that the soul in prayer causes the body to move and is in turn moved by the body. And in St. Dominic's first way of prayer, we are told Dominic used to bow before any representation of Christ's humiliation on the cross. In a similar way, Dante's doubled over penitents are bowed as though to Christ and to others, in imitation of Christ's humility. Thus, the penitent's stooping down reverses the prideful tendency to exalt oneself while diminishing others. Their bent, burdened posture performs and disposes the prideful to a newly humble, deferential relation to others. In this posture, the penitent souls walk while saying together the prayer with which Purgatorio 11 begins. It is a glossed version of the prayer that Jesus taught us, a prayer that was tremendously important to early and medieval Christian thinkers. I'm talking about the Lord's Prayer found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Augustine taught that the Lord's Prayer was an exercise in receiving its admonishments and remedies for pride. And from Augustine's Confessions, Dante might also have drawn the notion of pride as a burden, thus arriving at this idea of the crouched, burdened posture of humility that these penitent prideful adopt on this terrace. But here, the penitent's recitation of the prayer is translated into physical action. It is reiterated in the verbal language that describes them as praying with their bodies. They pray while walking with their heavy burden. And I'm getting a much more graphic idea of that heavy burden having heard Nancy's talk. I'm actually feeling after Nancy's talk that I actually don't know as much about pain as I thought. But stick with me. So in saying Dante's gloss on this prayer, Dante's version of the prayer, praying while walking under their heavy burdens, the prideful must humble themselves explicitly and in a way that changes them. Their prayer is also specifically directed toward a much broader pilgrim fellowship, not only toward those other penitent souls around them, but towards those on earth who also pray for them. Next slide, please. So in the last lines of the prayer, the prideful explicitly direct their attention to others, paraphrasing the petition to receive forgiveness as we forgive others. The penitent go on to pray not on their own behalf, but on behalf of those who have stayed behind, those still on earth, that they might not be tempted, but be freed from evil. Interestingly, the only person present who fits that description, a person who has stayed behind in the sense of still being alive on earth, is Dante. So this prayer seems specially directed to him. It is a reminder that even as Dante increasingly participates in and enacts humility with the penitent prideful, Dante remains a sinful creature, not yet fully transformed, not yet fully humble. As he walks along with the penitent, Dante begins to bend down, the better to talk with the penitent souls that he meets. And you can see this bent posture in this image. Dante is the one in blue in this image. In this bent position, Dante is now recognized by a soul who is finally able to turn his head. And Dante recognizes him. His name is Oderisi da Gubbio, an illuminator of manuscripts. And this is what they say to each other. Next slide, please. "Oh," I said to him, "are you not Oderisi, the honor of Gubbio and the honor of that art called illumination in Paris?" "Brother," he said, "those pages laugh more than Franco Bolognese brushes. The honor is now his, and mine in part. Certainly I would not have been so courteous while I lived because of the great desire of excellence that my heart was intent on. For such pride here we pay the fee, and I would not yet be here were it not that, still being able to sin, I turned to God. O vain glory of human powers, how briefly green at its summit it stays, if it is not followed by more rustic seasons. Cimabue believed that in painting he held the field, and now Giotto has the cry, so that the fame of the first is darkened. Just so one Guido has taken from the other the glory of our language, and perhaps he is born who will drive both of them from the nest." They go on, but I'll stop there. This is, let's say, a pretty long speech about who is the greatest, from a penitent soul who was working through his pride problem. Oderisi, we can see, is learning to walk the walk of humility and even to talk the talk. Learning being the operative word. He honors the artist who has surpassed him in greatness, but reserves a part of that honor for himself. He makes these glib claims about the vain glory of human power while talking quite a lot about who surpassed who. And Dante, meanwhile, well, for Dante it is just as complicated. Dante is putting in the mouth of Oderisi a speech that gives honor to two poets named Guido, that's Guido Guinizelli and Guido Cavalcanti, two poets he knew personally, while suggesting that another poet might be living now. Who is, wait for it, going to be even better. In other words, Oderisi's suggestion of a new unnamed poet born to succeed the great Guidos of their age is presumably a not-so-subtle reference to himself. The way that Dante narrates the scene, and the way that Dante's fellow pilgrim, Oderisi, speaks in the scene, offers two examples of people who are in flux, working on their pride problem, we encounter them in this ragged state, trying to practice humility and doing it rather imperfectly. Their pride, and especially Dante's pride, is still showing. Dante is an imperfect narrator, a poet who is practicing humility, who is both a Christian and an artist, and who is on his way to salvation. He is, in other words, a pilgrim and a work in progress. And his poem records these bumpy moments of learning on the go, even as he endeavors to participate in and effect the process of transformation. I want to mention one more encounter from the Terrace of Pride in closing, because this soul, a prideful penitent named Provenzano Salvani, seems to draw inspiration from a Christological model of humility. Rodriguez tells Dante about Salvani's life. Next slide. That life was marked by a remarkable range of pride and self-humbling. Salvani's presumptuous pride in seizing Sienese rule for himself brought him to this terrace. But on one occasion, shortly before his own death, he dressed in sackcloth and begged in order to raise the money required to ransom a friend who had been captured by Charles of Anjou. And this is how Salvani's story is told. When he was living most gloriously, he said, freely, in the Campo at Siena, he set aside his shame and took his stand. And there, to free his friend from the punishment that he suffered in the prison of Charles, he brought himself to tremble in every vein. More I cannot say, and I know I speak obscurely, but little time will pass before your neighbors will act so that you can gloss it. This work set him free from those confines. Odarizzi's language here is Christological. Salvani brought himself to tremble in every vein. Si condusse a tremar per ogni vena. A description that implicitly compares Salvani's act of begging to the great work of Christ, who saved humankind with trembling, bleeding veins in his humble death. Toward the conclusion of Salvani's story, Odarizzi also draws a parallel to the life of humility that Dante will have to embrace when he, like Salvani in sackcloth, will be reduced to poverty and wandering in exile. Remember that the historical Dante wrote the comedy long after he was exiled, but in 1300, when the poem is set. The pilgrim Dante has not yet experienced his political rise and fall. He doesn't know what is about to happen to him. The concluding line of Salvani's story and of this canto, this work freed him from those confines, refers overtly to the successful liberation of Salvani's friend, but it also holds broader implications. Salvani's voluntary humility, subjecting his pride to the good of his friend, embracing poverty, begging, released Salvani from a very long sentence in purgatory. But Salvani's act also freed him from the confines of pride itself. And in that freedom, Salvani was able to accomplish a work of goodness. Finally, we might read this line to speak tacitly to the humility of Dante's exile, for under the conditions of exile, inasmuch as we can understand and imagine them, Dante had continually to ask for and depend upon the help and hospitality of friends and neighbors. And this acknowledgement of dependence in itself is an exercise in letting go of pride and embracing humility. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it was under these conditions that Dante too was able to achieve what is now indisputably recognized as his greatest work, his greatest opera, the comedy itself. What I want to leave you then with is the idea that Dante was a pilgrim, an inadvertent pilgrim, but a pilgrim all the same, when he wrote the comedy, and that the comedy itself can be read as a record of his pilgrim transformation, that process of sanctification, imperfect and incomplete as it presumably was. And if the narrative and the poetry of the comedy is itself in development, if it can be understood as a reflection of the ways that Dante is being changed in the course of his journey, then we might be inspired ourselves to take note of the ways that the words of our mouths, our language of faith, our language as we make our way in the middle of the journey of our life, offers reminders that we ourselves are works in progress, each of us a patchwork of sin and grace, being sanctified as we work and walk and talk, as we make our way to our pilgrim destinations and to our eternal home. Thank you. I'm told I have 2 minutes for questions.
Simply. That was absolutely wonderful. I exactly thought Mummy were using cover the physical journey on our feet, and what you said about, in mind book words and the arts that can so come from Dante. The idea of literature being a colloquium not only to the author, but as a piece. And on that note, I'd ask you how, from the beginning point at which you discovered Dante to the end for which you wrote the word. Rachel has her PhD thesis was on Genesis, humility of Dante, specifically authority, the English press to press. So from the beginning point when you discovered Dante, and now, how has it shaped your Christian journey, your personal, spiritual, heavenly passions? If that isn't too personal.
It's not too personal. I'm not sure it's answerable, but I'll let me try to hazard an answer anyway. I think as an adult, as a person who works, it's very hard not to assume that your prestige and your importance that your prestige is your importance. And I can think any of us is very good at separating them. But I think journeying with Dante has served as a continual reminder that those are very different things, and that when we are baptized, we're invited and other people take vows to support our journey to grow up into the full stature of Christ. And that relativizes everything else. The fact that I'm a mother and I wrote a book and I did a PhD. Everything else that I think from day to day makes me important is all relativized by that. And Dante helps me remember that. How's that?
We are going to say grace so that we can have lunch, and we'll talk through the mechanics of that. But before we say grace, before lunch, there are 3 announcements, and they're going to be done by the people with whom there's a great connection to the announcements. So, Nancy, you had an announcement that you wanted to make, but come on up and do that, and then we'll have the other 2.
Well, thank you. I passed out 2 sheets. One is a newsletter for the Friends of the Anglican Pilgrim Center, of which I am the president. And the second one is a notice that we have a new chapel there. And I would offer to you that we have a website. The address is on there. I have some cards with the address on it. And if you would like to know anything about it or join our webpage, either look on the sheets or talk to me. That's my announcement. And if you're in Santiago, we would love to have you come and visit our center. Thank you, Nancy.
And you have this, you have the sheet that is titled Path of Miracles, and Jane wants to tell us all about the cantata.
Hello, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jane Meditz, and I am a parishioner here at the Advent. And as it so happens, I will be performing in this concert, Path of Miracles, in just a few months. And it'll be done by Cantata Singers, which is a fantastic choral group in the area. And why does this connect with Colloquium? It's because the piece, Path of Miracles, is based directly on the Camino. And I heard it performed live in New Haven a number of years ago and was absolutely blown away by it, and it always stuck with me. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to sing in its performance, and I'm thrilled to be able to share about it with you all. And I love what the poster says, to deepen your understanding of the Camino through music. So I hope you can join for that concert at St. Cecilia Parish in a few months, right here in Boston. And as you might also see on the flyer, the administration of Cantata Singers was generous enough to create a 10% discount for tickets. So if you use that code, you'll get 10% off your ticket purchase. And as I said previously, it is a mind-blowing piece. Probably even just a little bit as mind-blowing as it is to actually walk the Camino. It's an incredible, awe-inspiring piece, and I'm very excited to be a part of it. So thank you.
I will say,
Yes, and we have a performer who has...
I'm here because I sang it last time, and we're doing it again, and I can also vouch for it being fabulous. You don't be with waste for it as I did. Looking forward to you, little girl. I'm going to talk to you about it.
Oh, yes, it was written by Jody Talbot
Yes, Jody
20 years ago in 2005. So it's a really, really neat, slightly more modern piece. It's very transcendent. Thank you all.
One more shameless plug for St. Michael's Conference. If you have this, you should have this brochure in your hand. This is St. Michael's Conference has been active since 1960, taking 2 years off for the COVID epidemic. St. Michael's Conference is a week-long educational conference for high school and college students from all over the United States, largely East Coast parishes, that meets in West Hartford, Connecticut. So your next pilgrimage for your young person in high school or college is to West Hartford, Connecticut, a week in June. The dates are here. It is a conference that you can tell from the list of courses from which the young people need to choose on the inside of the brochure that it is taught. The courses are of some substance, and they are in the Catholic tradition. We find that when a young person goes to the conference, between the time that they're 14, that's the youngest, and 21, that's the oldest at which someone can attend, if they go once, they will return to the conference year after year because it's life-changing for them. They draw closer to Jesus, or they may even draw more deeply into their life in Christ, and it's done by three means: education, taking the courses; worship, which is done in a traditional Anglican form, much like we do here at the Church of the Advent; and fellowship, because they become so close to other Christians that is a strength for them through the rest of their year. So they will come back the next year. Just as an aside, too, to show you the history and the depth of the conference. I mean, the Meads are now going on 4 generations going to this conference. Nancy's mother was on the staff of the conference. Father Mead and Mrs. Mead. Father Mead was on the staff of the conference for 20 years, took a 20-year hiatus from the faculty, and now he's had been back for 2 years, and will be there. Their children and their grandchildren are now attending St. Michael's Conference. So thank you for all of that, for keeping this conference going. There were here at the Advent, are probably this year there will be 4 or 5 of our young people going from the Advent. Again, it's young people coming together to form a community for 1 week, and in that 1 week, under the patronage of St. Michael, the Archangel, they are strengthened to go through their Christian lives and deepen them all the next year. Because we know everything that can get at someone's soul is out there for these young people, so we get to them now, strengthen their faith and deepen their faith so that they can make it through the rest of their life. That's what and I'll be quiet about St. Michael's Conference, but if you know of a 14 or 21-year-old, your son or daughter should be at this conference. If you don't know, hand this brochure to a young person in high school or college to come to the conference next year. Let us pray. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts which we are about to receive from thy bounty. Give us grateful hearts and make us always fully knowledgeable of the needs of others. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. This is very simple if you want to eat. What you can do is, if you're facing this way and you're away from the table, take your chair and turn it around and face the table. If you're facing the table right now, leave it there. And we're going to form, I hope, 4 lines from the back to the front to go right out through those double doors over there, and the sandwich lunches are there available for you. Bring it right back to the table, and we have an hour to do this, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. Thank you very much.